Oh, Dolly Parton, just you and me now. We'll have to do our best. So, I'm just gonna be a little bit mean and just give up the ghost before we even have a chance to pull away. You've seen the thumbnail, you know what we're talking about. Today's essay is going to be exploring how two seemingly very different work, one a landmark psychological horror video game, and the other a lot of best-selling contemporary romances, we're not going to be able to say that without stuttering, sorry, convey a hidden structure of narrative manipulation, internalized guilt, and audience alignment with a deeply flawed protagonist. On one hand is Silent Hill 2, a game that presents us with James Sunderland, a man drawn to the fog-shrouded town of Silent Hill by a letter from his dead wife, only for the story to reveal that he murdered her and buried the truth. I promise, I feel like everybody forgets the fact that he killed her. I'm not gonna let you forget that. We're gonna keep saying that a lot in this video, and if that makes you upset, sorry. And on the other hand, there's all of Colleen Hoover's novels, which have been critiqued. I say that politely because there's other words I could use, but critique, for how her female protagonists seem to internalize abusive dynamics, doubt themselves, and often seem to perpetuate or even rationalize unhealthy relationships. The key thesis, like again, I'm just giving up the ghost right here because if it's not your jam, I don't want you to stick around. We're just going to give up the ghost right here and now. The key thesis that you're going to have to take away from this is that both works rely on a form of narrative gaslighting, not exactly of the protagonist by another, but of the protagonist's own self and by extension, the audience perception of them. Both invite you to side with the protagonist, even as the story gradually undermines the alignment, revealing that the protagonist is not simply a victim or an innocent actor, but complicit, self-deceptive, and morally ambiguous. We'll trace how Silent Hill 2 uses environment, narrative, and character to lure us into sympathy, and then confront us with the truth, because Silent Hill 2 is about him killing his wife. Like I said, I'm going to say that a lot in this video. And how Colleen Hoover uses romance and trauma as a form of storytelling to similar ends, inviting the reader to sympathize, to hope, to believe, and then to recognize the protagonist's self-gaslighting. What this means culturally, why such narratives are so powerful now, how they reflect broader social patterns of trauma, self-blame, and internalized guilt, and what we should be cautious about. Oh, Dolly Parton. Just you and me now. Pray for me in the hour of my need. So let's just get this over with and start with everybody's favorite, because Colleen Hoover is, seen as not a good faith actor, but we'll go with it. We're just going to start with Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 is often cited as one of the greatest video game narratives precisely because it uses the medium to explore internal psychological horror, trauma, guilt, repression, and the way a mind constructs a facade of normalcy. The game opens with James Sunderland, a widower, arriving in Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his deceased wife, Mary. On the surface, when you play the game for the very first time, it reads like a grief story. A husband haunted, seeking closure for the untimely death of his wife, and how it's just messing with him. Because at first, we identify with James. He seems vulnerable, wounded, and honestly, he does seem earnest in his grief and how he is processing his wife's death. The environment, it's Silent Hill. Foggy streets, unsettling monsters. It's oppressive and aligns us with his confusion and his fear. But gradually, the narrative and the game world unfolds to indicate that the town of Silent Hill is not simply a haunted place, but a manifestation of James' psyche. Monsters, the other, the shifting architecture, all reflects his guilt, his self-deception, his denial. For example, the town draws upon the psyche of its visitors and ultimately form alternative versions of itself. Like I said in my Silent Hill F video, it's the worst therapist in the world, but it does actually get you to the point. One analysis notes, for instance, Eddie represents James' hatred towards others, while Angela is the embodiment of James' self-loathing. And I can give it to him. That's a pretty apt way of describing how James views other people in his own grief-stricken narrative that he is not only gaslighting himself about, but also us, the player. The implication is that the enemy is not just external, it's internal, because James is both victim and perpetrator. Like I said, that's true when you play it the first time, but if you play it more than once and you already know the gag that he killed his wife, it changes everything. That's where the twist comes in. James James did it, and we are slowly shown it playing it the first time, and then it is never not apparent to you when you play it the second time. Because the most disturbing moment in the game's revelation is that Mary did not simply die of her illness. Rather, James killed her, and then for reasons that still, skip people, he repressed this memory and somehow got off with it scot-free. This should be the point that people take away from Silent Hill 2. He killed her, lied to himself, got away with it, and then has the audacity to sit there and tell us, the audience, I'm the victim. What? This revelation reframes everything. All our identification with James, all our sympathy, is placed in tension with the truth that he is a murderer. Albeit he's haunted by his own crime, but he is not the victim in this narrative. The narrative has gaslit us in a sense. We thought James was a victim, and the game led us to side with him throughout the entire thing. The game reveals he is an agent of horror. I know a lot of people constantly harp on and on about how, oh, I love Pyramid Head. Pyramid Head is James. Silent Hill is taking all of James' trauma and all of his, abuse, let's call it that, and reflecting it back at him like a weird funhouse. Pyramid Head is James. Pyramid Head is all of the negative, toxic emotions that he used to kill his wife, and it haunts him and it stalks him throughout this game. Because yeah, he feels bad about it, but he doesn't feel bad enough to not still have these feelings. Pyramid Head makes the point of slapping the nurses in this game around like it's going out of style. Because that's exactly how James feels about women in his life, specifically his wife. This dynamic is what makes the game so haunting. The player is complicit in James' delusions. By playing his role, we accept his perspective, we trust his narrative, but the story undermines that trust. The horror is as much about self-recognition for James and for us, the player, as it is about monsters. One writer says, quote, Silent Hill 2 questions whether or not what we perceive as reality and whether or not we're ready to face it. The effects of our alignment with James become uneasy and then fraught, because when he's the victim and Silent Hill is messing with him, we feel for him. It's when you realize that he is not the good guy, you seriously start to question how much empathy are you gonna give this man before you just outright go, nah my guy, you are on your own. This dynamic is what makes the game so haunting. Player is complicit in his delusions. By playing his role, we accept that what he's telling us has to be the truth, but that's not true. It's gaslighting as a structural motif. Though we might not use the term gaslighting when discussing Silent Hill 2, or at least I've never met anybody else when I've talked about it use this term, but I'm using it. Functionally, it is present. James has told himself a version of events. Mary's illness, his heroic patience, her untimely death. That is not at all what happens. Mary is sick. He has some patience, and the worse she gets, the worse his patience becomes towards her. It's what leads to his murdering of her, and that may have accommodated his guilt. The town, the monsters, the shifting reality are manifestations of his inner deception. The player is drawn into his narrative until they cannot ignore the truth. In summary, Silent Hill 2 offers a masterclass in how horror can manipulate alignment, inviting empathy with a flawed protagonist, building investments, then turning that investment into discomfort by revealing truths that the protagonist, and thus the player, has been suppressing. Because let's be 100% honest, if you were paying attention while playing Silent Hill 2, some of the things he says and how he says it make him seem like a really questionable guy. But because when you first play it, he's the protagonist, he's the hero, he has to be. Silent Hill is full of monsters, he can't possibly be the bad guy, and then he is. And I think that's the main takeaway from this. James gaslights us, the audience, so much that to this day I don't think I really see a lot of people discussing that James is the bad guy. He's not a hero at all. It's just that Silent Hill is so messed up that we wouldn't want anybody to be in there because it's that terrible. Turning now to something a little bit lighter, because all of the cover art says it's lighter, even though none of of it is, to Colleen Hoover. On the surface, they might appear far removed from a horror game, but they share a surprisingly similar structure of internal conflict, unreliable self-narration, and the reader's alignment with the female protagonist whose self-deception or self-undermining personality is central. Hoover writes predominantly in the contemporary romance, new adult, psychological thriller space. Her protagonists, who are frequently women, are emotionally vulnerable, often carrying trauma, and are drawn into relationships that are messy, damaging, and even abusive. A key example is It Ends With Us. That book is a whole entire can of worms I won't get too deep into, but it brings my point up really well. So It Ends With Us depicts Lily Bloom, whose abusive relationship with Ryle Kincaid places her in conflict with her first love, Atlas Corrigan. Total side note, right? This is not part of the script. The names for Colleen Hoover's books are terrible. They're absolute dog water, and I understand as somebody who's trying to get my own book off the ground, I shouldn't be critiquing this much, but I have to. Like, girl, what are these names? We can reach a little bit further than the first 6 things that come to mind. Anyway, back to my point. Critics note that Hoover wrote romanticized domestic violence and uses a female protagonist who's internally damaged. On the other hand, supporters agree that the book allows readers to engage with trauma and survive it. I'm gonna be honest with you, we should not be trying to romanticize these kinds of relationships, like at all, not even a little bit. In Hoover's narrative structure, the female protagonist is often complicit in her own suffering. She questions her perceptions, her rationalities, her wrongdoing, of which there are not that many, if I'm being honest. She believes the love story will redeem the abuser, or that she must forgive or change in order to get her, air quotes, happy ending. This is a form of internal gaslighting. Sure, this is bad, but I'm the one who must fix it. Indeed, one critique states her novels reinforce harmful stereotypes. Women are doormats, men are possessive and borderline abusive, which, if I'm being 100% honest, if these books were marketed as bodice rippers and not romance, I wouldn't have a lot to complain about, because bodice rippers aren't romance. There's some really messed up stuff dressed up as a romance, but you don't go into it assuming this is how a relationship is supposed to be. The reader is invited to align deeply with the protagonist's perspective. We see her first-person thoughts, hope for her love story, believe in her redemption arc, but beneath the surface, the story often reveals that the protagonist's beliefs in herself and often others is little more than a coping mechanism, sometimes perpetuating the abusive dynamic. Much like the player in Silent Hill 2 identifies with James only to be challenged, the reader of Hoover's novels engage with the protagonist's emotional arc, which is as follows: falling in love, conflict, family drama and or ex-relationship drama, healing, marriage, kid. Is that a bad formula? No. If it works, it works. But it's every single book, only to confront the fact that the emotional dynamic is toxic. The love may be a trap. The protagonist must break not only with the partner, but with her own narrative. For example, It Ends With Us ends not in a pure fairy tale redemption, but in conscious escape from abuse, which is I'm not going to say nuanced, but I can't think of a different word for this, so a nuanced, emotionally fraught resolution. The gaslighting here is subtler. It is the protagonist gaslighting herself, and so the reader, by extension, is also like getting secondhand gaslighting into believing that love will save, or that the partner will change, or that her role is to endure and forgive. The narrative eventually asks, is this story truly one of romance, or is it one of self-recognition and escape? I know that sounds like a lot of words, right? A lot of big words for Elmo, so let's just break it down. These are parallels. I know it doesn't sound like it, but it is. In Silent Hill 2, James arrives believing one story: loving husband, grieving widower. I didn't do anything to deserve this. Why is this happening? We side with him. Then we uncover evidence of his guilt. His entire narrative collapses. Our alignment becomes accessories to his depravity, his murder, his gaslighting. In Hoover's novels, the female protagonist begins believing one story: romance will heal me, I can rescue him, love conquers, we'll get through this with his family, his ex-lover, my ex-lover, my problems, his problems, whatever. We'll go through a little bit of a rough patch, then we'll get married and we'll have a kid. We side with her. We witness manipulative, damaging behavior, but because she keeps hand-waving it away, we think, okay, she must know better. And then she doesn't. The protagonist must recognize it and change her own story, and she doesn't. Every single woman in Colleen Hoover's book makes me want to scream, and I've never read the books, and I can admit this is just me piggybacking off of other people who have read these books. But it doesn't change the fact that reader alignment is tested within these narratives, is because at what point do we just admit, Colleen Hoover, you write like r/men writing women sometimes. What is happening? Because both of these narratives rely on internalized deception. James' denial of killing his wife, all of Colleen Hoover's female protagonists denying the fact that they're getting beaten around like it's Boxing Day. And it invites the audience to trust a perception that gradually proves to be not only unstable, but unsustainable for a narrative. Why do these narratives resonate with us? What does the mirroring between horror video game and popular romance trauma literature tell us about the broader cultural implications and the movement, or even the moment? Well, that's easy. In both cases, the protagonists carry trauma and guilt. James for the murder of his wife, and the female protagonist for past wounds or present patterns that she's never addressed. The narrative becomes a way of controlling the story. For James, Silent Hill is the stage of repression. For the Hoover protagonist, the romance is a way to reframe suffering into redemption. These narratives reflect our cultural preoccupation with self-blame, hidden wounds, and the stories we tell ourselves to survive. In particular, Hoover's work rides the wave of trauma romance, readers seeking catharsis, identification with damaged but resilient protagonists. As reported, Hoover's popularity is driven in part by her willingness to engage with dark themes of abuse and survival. In Silent Hill 2, though, well, let's just be frank. Silent Hill 2 is decades older, but it taps into a psychological horror of living with guilt and self-deception. The reason why I personally believe that these narratives are able to transcend generations is because everybody believes that they got good damage out of all the terrible things that happened. They believe that because they suffered and they grew and all this other shit, they're the perfect victim. Here's the gag. There is no perfect victim. There is no good damage. It's just damage.
I have to. Why? Because if I don't, that means that all the damage I got isn't good damage. It's just damage.
Gaslighting is usually an interpersonal abuse term. Here, we're using it metaphorically, right? The commoner's term of gaslighting. This narrative leads the audience to trust a perception that is incomplete or false, then reveals its instability. This is powerful because it forces the audience to question not only the protagonist, but themselves. Who am I aligning with? What story have I accepted? What have I ignored? In Silent Hill 2, the player must reassess their alliance with James once the truth is revealed, because up until that point, James presents himself to us as the perfect victim, that he got something out of all of his damage. He got good damage out of it. You come to find out, no, not only is he not a victim, the damage that has been inflicted onto him is self-inflicted, because he inflicted so much damage onto his wife, it killed her. In Hoover's novels, the reader must examine their emotional investment in the heroine's story, and perhaps recognize that romantic hope alone can mask destructive patterns. This kind of self-reflection is emotionally heavy, but also culturally significant. We live in a moment where mental health discourse, trauma awareness, and self-narratives are key. Thus, these works don't just tell stories, they implicate the audience in how the story is believed, and that's important. Because while Silent Hill 2 tries constantly to tell us that James is a victim, he's not. He's a narcissistic, abusive man who killed his wife and has been cruel to every other woman he has met in the game. And before you tell me, no, he hasn't been, really think about every time he interacts with anybody in the game. If it's female, he's really short and snippy with them, which you can write off when you play the first time, that that maybe he's just stressed. When you play that again and again and again, he's just an asshole. He's also short and snippy with men, but on a less vindictive level, because he respects men a little bit more than he respects women, but not by that much. These works don't just tell us stories, they implicate the audience in how the story is believed. And I think that's really important, because gaslighting isn't usually given weight because it's been so overused. We, and I say this very liberally, gaslighting has been used for everything underneath the sun other than what it's actually used for, which is the systematic lying to somebody to make them believe that their reality is false. Because the risk and reward of these structures is a story, and I do mean that, it is a story, because there is both reward and risk in these narrative structures, even though we don't see it immediately. The reward is that they can deliver deep emotional catharsis, invite reflection, generate empathy for the flawed characters, and show survival rather than perfection. Something that speaks to people, because if somebody is too perfect in a narrative, you don't connect with them. In Hoover's case, her readers often say the books help them recognize abusive dynamics or feel less alone. However, that reward also has a dark side, the risks. These narratives can normalize or romanticize harmful patterns. For example, critics argue that Hoover's work romanticized domestic violence and positions protagonists as complicit victims rather than empowering survivors. In Silent Hill's 2 case, the horror is intentionally disquieting, but some players might simply enjoy the twist without acknowledging the deeper critique of self-deception. So as consumers and critics, we must remain aware of what we are aligning with and why. By connecting a horror video game and a popular romance trauma novel writing, I swear to God, I really wish that wasn't like what constantly keeps popping up in my head, but there we are. We highlight how the same structural mechanics apply across genres: internalized guilt, unreliable self-narration, audience alignment, and the collapse of protagonist credibility. They are, by extension of both the genres of video game and book, unreliable narrators. It also suggests that our cultural appetite for narratives about flawed protagonists, about trauma, redemption, is connected across media. The convergence is thus less surprising than it might seem. We're drawn to stories in which the safe narrative fractures, and we must recognize our complicity in believing. We like complex stories where everything is a little messy, but we only like it so messy. To sum up, both Silent Hill 2 and Colleen Hoover's narrative engage us in a form of narrative gaslighting, inviting sympathy and alignment with a protagonist whose self-story is flawed. Silent Hill 2 does this via environment, symbolism, gradual revelation of guilt. Hoover does this via emotional romance, trauma arcs, and the unraveling of self-justification. The effect on the audience is to question, what story have I been reading? What story am I telling myself? What lie am I willing to swallow? Culturally, this speaks to an age of what's the best way to say this? Trauma consciousness, where stories of internal landscapes matter. The benefit is deep reflection. A danger is unrecognized complicitly in the very dynamic the stories critique. In conclusion, the connection reveals a truth about story. We are often more invested in the hope of redemption than the truth of complicity. And sometimes the story must pull a rug from under our feet so that way we turn a mirror on ourselves. And that's really hard to do. Some people just don't like doing, and that's okay. That's all I've got for today. Save me, Dolly Parton, for I know that I must edit this to the best of my ability, and it will not be that good. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!